technical cooperation projects, but to try and distill out of that, I suppose, where we sit in terms of this issue of employer engagement and what some of our experiences have been in that, but also to try and share some examples of what, in our world represents good practice. But I think, as Karina said, you can distill elements of good practice from that reflect some of the developments in more developed countries. So that's really there to give you a bit of a flavour. When we're talking about employer engagement, I like Simon's sort of framework this morning about financing culture and institutions as a way of organising it. So we're doing some work at the firm level in terms of developing country return on investment around apprenticeship programs. Doing some work with the OECD at the moment. Looking at how employers are engaged in apprenticeships very much at the local level, and that's linked to their LEAD program, which is focused on local level of engagement. But I think this question about what level of engagement you're talking about also has to be considered, because we're not just talking about enterprise institution links. We're talking about the links between associations or industry bodies into different parts of the system in terms of governance, but also in terms of labour market information systems, quality assurance, regulatory frameworks, as well as delivery and assessment. So for example, we've done some work here looking at skills anticipation systems across 60 countries in combination with the ETF, CEDEFOP and OECD. What are the institutional arrangements that are in place? What role do social partners play in that? What methods and tools and techniques are used to look at skills anticipation? Another piece here looking at the involvement of trade unions, ILO, tripartite organisation, sort of trying to see where there is good practice, and there are some good practice, particularly there in terms of unions being involved in the direct delivery of training for their members, as well as participating in the open training market through their own run training centres. And the same sort of thing, guides come out of our research, different policy tools for constituents that are used at the local level by our specialist and country officers. So now to shift to some of the practical experiences, I want to focus on I guess 5 different areas. That's by no means comprehensive, but I guess reflects where we do have some examples. But I think increasingly for us, the issue of coordination or measures to try and address coordination failures at the local level as well as at the national level are increasingly part of the challenge that we're responding to in particular countries. So not only in terms of coordination between social partners at the sector level, but at the institutional level and at the policy level as well. I think in developing countries, probably more than in developed countries, although you're all experienced with the challenge, very deep silos run, very little coordination across different policy domains, and that is not only just within the education and training system, but then because skills is a cross-cutting issue, skills and trade, skills and regional development, skills and industry development. Those linkages are quite problematic as well. And then from a development perspective, the whole challenge of donor harmonisation in terms of who's funding what are they trying to achieve, who's tripping over each other at the local level in terms of programs, policies, and whether they're consistent or not, and whether or not the government really understands that there are perhaps different currents in train because of the different approaches of different partners. So just to focus on the sort of national skills policies and systems, that's a very broad sort of, gambit, but I wanted to focus on here in terms of assessment and certification of training and assessment and certification models, and share an experience here from India, where you had a new sort of public-private partnership established, NSDC, a lot of money from the central government about trying to break with the traditional system of vocational education and training dominated by the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Labour, which had a scheme which was competency-based, and this NSDC very much driving the development of national qualifications competency-based qualifications, competency-based assessment, trying to introduce that into a system that relied on very traditional assessment models, curriculum, centrally developed curriculum, and very weak links with industry. So here you see industry skills councils being set up, very much along the lines of UK, Australia, etc. Them driving the standards and qualifications development process, and actually being given the opportunity to really influence the dynamics of the training market. And the NSDC were quite successful because separate to this, well, I'll come to that, separate to this they were funding private training providers, equity, to private sector interests to set up training organisations to participate in this new training market, and at the same time giving them control over assessment and certification. So you had industry-run assessment centres being set up, industry in control of the certification process, and a training market for certification driven by this, these sources of income, both through that scheme and through this one. So what we saw there was, issues with conflict of interest in terms of industry controlling the standard setting, controlling the certification and assessment, and also because of this funding arrangement, entering into some partnerships with training organisations that I guess raise questions around the need for those skills and the fact that there are examples of large corporates putting a lot of their existing employees through this scheme for the purpose of taking advantage of the subsidies and so forth. But the point I want to make here, I guess, is, I think the question of employer engagement, is fundamentally linked to what role do they have in the system. Because if they don't have a role that gives them some sort of control potentially over quality in the case of delivery and assessment, or if there isn't a revenue model in it for them, then I think you're going to get different sorts of reactions and levels of engagement. And that's a bit of a lead into the work that we do on sectoral approaches, because I suppose one of the key pillars of the ILO approach to skills in our development work is encouraging sectoral approaches, because that's a good way for social partners to come together to look at skills issues. And so, I think it's interesting also sector skills councils here being defunded. In the Netherlands, the knowledge centres being defunded. In Australia, the industry skills councils being defunded. In New Zealand, the ITOs going out to a competitive funding process. In South Africa, the setters being, they're being brought in under the board of the, it's not SACWA, it's the other entity, but basically moving from being independent entities. So at one end, where you've got systems that have perhaps been in a process of reform for some years, moving away from these independent sectoral skills bodies, at the other end, you've got evidence of developing countries who are engaging in a process of reform driven by a bit of an orthodoxy about what you do to your vet system to make it work. Oh, you take a sectoral approach, so let's have sector skills councils. You've got evidence of increasing interest in sector skills bodies in developing countries, and we certainly encourage that. We're supporting their establishment in some countries. In some cases it is organic because of the fundamental failure of the vet system in the country to meet the skill needs, but in other cases it's donor driven or linked to this sort of orthodoxy. But you see then, as you have here, sectoral approaches delivering a range of outcomes. And I think, the question of engagement really depends on how that sectoral approach manifests itself. Sector skills councils are only one example of that, because you can have, a sectoral approach, through committees under a regulatory body. You can have a sectoral approach through an apex body like the National Skills Development Council in Bangladesh, which will take a sectoral approach in the way that it drives sort of qualification development. I think it also depends on what focus it has. Do these councils just look at initial pre-employment qualifications and skills, or is it also linked to continuing TVET? And whether or not they have advisory, technical or legal responsibility. So if they don't have a mandated role within the system, then I think that clearly the sort of industry that you attract, or the industry representatives that you attract, the buy-in that you get varies considerably. So little influence, advisory role only, no funding attached to it. You're not going to get CEOs of large companies stepping up and participating in that. If they've got money, if they have a locked-in role to the process of qualification development or regulation of the training market or labour market information, then I think you get a different sort of response. Also, funding then is clearly an issue, and so those sector-based levies that do exist, again, are a driver of employer engagement. And who they report to, if they're buried down within the system somewhere, then again, you're not going to get the same sort of engagement as if it's more high profile. They have a direct line to a minister or inputs into some senior sort of council. Making up another large part of our work is our work on apprenticeships. And just to be clear, because there's a lot of sort of issues around terminology, we talk about an employment-based model. So it's a combination of on and off the job training, but there's payment involved, social protections involved as well, and it's recognised sort of certification. And that's an idea or a bit of a spread of some of the work that we're doing in apprenticeships, and a lot of it takes a sectoral approach. So it's sitting down with the social partners in that sector and looking specifically at what's wrong with the current system. And often it's broken or it's not working. In South Asia, for example, Sri Lanka, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh all have statutory-based apprenticeship systems that are based on the British model, but very, very low participation rates. We did some work, you look at, say, Switzerland, Germany, number of apprentices per 1,000 employees is 40. 39, UK before the reforms is about 17, you get to India it was 0.01. So very, very small, but there and something to build on. And so, whilst there's a lot of engagement there, I think one of the issues that connects back to the sectoral sort of experience is, we really have to focus on those areas where there are skill shortages. And where employers are saying, look, it's not working for us and we're having real challenges getting entry-level people with the right skills, the system's not working for us. So being able to identify what those sectors are and have some data around that, drives our engagement with other things like apprenticeship reform. And I think, again, looking at this question of what level are you talking about, what level of engagement, apprenticeship reform obviously connects with the sector level and the workplace level, but there's also some work we've been doing at a national level through the Global Apprenticeship Network. Can I ask, has anyone here heard of that? GAN? Yeah? Okay. So it's, we fund them actually at the moment. It's set up mainly by the International Organisation of Employers. And it started small. The idea is that there's this global thing. So if you're familiar with the European Alliance for Apprenticeships, it's similar to that, but I guess it's got more of a developing country experience. It started with Turkey, Indonesia and Spain with the first 3 networks, but I think now they've grown to about 9. And it's very much at that CEO level, where I think as much they're trying to leverage the sort of competition I think that exists between corporates about, oh, well, there's this new thing coming up, I'm involved in that, aren't you? And so there's a bit of, targeting of large employers, industry associations, as a way of harnessing industry support to deal with real or perceived skill mismatches with a focus on apprenticeships. But it does take quite a broad approach to apprenticeships, so it talks about internships, what we call quality apprenticeships, but also anything that's got to do with work-based learning. So they've thrown the net quite broadly, but they're starting to have some impact. To move to a more concrete example of how employers have got together, there's this experience from Bangladesh, which I think it hasn't been too bad. So this was through a project that the ILO supported with EC funding. It was taking a sectoral approach, going through the normal standards, occupational standards, qualifications, linked to the introduction of an NQF, establishment of industry skills councils. And what one of the skills councils did in the leather sector, because he did an economic analysis, and the leather and leather goods sector was shown to have some potential and is a large employer. They basically set up a skills centre, had the skills centre registered within the regulatory framework that exists for TVET in Bangladesh, and they developed a new program, a 12-month program. 3 months of the program they were paid by the Centre of Excellence, which was operating through contributions from employers. The apprentice was then hosted out to the employer, and then the 9 months was on that individual enterprise payroll. COAL, as it's called in the centre, acted as a bit of a hub, and so would liaise with it's kind of a cluster-based thing because it's geographically based in a particular part of Dhaka. But they did the right thing. They allocated a supervisor, mentor for each enterprise for every trainee. There were logbooks linked to on-the-job training. There was a summative assessment done in the workplace, formative assessment done at the Centre of Excellence. They're putting through reasonable numbers for a single centre. There's dual certification, where previously that had been separate. You got a separate qualification for completing an apprenticeship to what you did if you actually were assessed as competent against the competencies. That's now part of the one program. And the Swiss, for example, are funding the extension of that centre in another sort of urban area to the south in Chittagong, where they're looking to set up another hub. And that's actually been quite transformative within that sector in terms of raising the profile of skills, getting employers to recognise the value of skills within that cluster, and increasing apprenticeship commencements within a sector where previously there were basically none. And there's some shots of the centre. Coming back to the GAN, there's actually a case study we've just done where there's a bit of a focus on an intermediary role, and that's taken by TISC, which is the sort of Employers Association, and TISC is a lead member of the GAN, the national network of the GAN in Turkey, and basically there's a labour market program that they say is apprenticeship based, but it's quite a short duration, that is managed by the employment agency. But basically the employment agency provides a bonus, if you like, to participating enterprises if they're part of GAN and get some support from the GAN network. So they're allowed a higher apprentice-employee ratio because the rationale is that GAN, or TISC as an implementer of this GAN network, which provides support to enterprises to take on apprenticeships, actually allows them to sort of expand the envelope within this structured program. And I think this question about the role that intermediaries play, whether or not they're a formal recognised role within the system and they're funded by government to fulfil that role, or whether or not it's more of an organic actors in the local labour market taking on that responsibility and bridging that gap between the two worlds of work and education and training, is clearly a success factor. And so you're seeing evidence of that in developing country contexts as well. When we talk about apprenticeships and the countries that we work in, you can't ignore the fact that the informal economy makes up a substantial part of economic activity If you exclude agriculture, you look at India, it's something like 92% of all economic activity is in the informal sector, which means businesses aren't registered, which means employees aren't covered by the normal sort of employment arrangements. So it's basically the black economy. But within that, in those countries, the largest skill formation system is basically this informal apprenticeship system that operates where you have traditional master craftsmen operating with learners that sometimes don't get paid. It's a deal done between the master crafts person and the parents of the young person that's placed in that business. It takes different forms. It's governed by its own set of rules, but they're informal, in the same way a formal apprenticeship system is governed by a set of rules that are formalised. And so a lot of the work we do is actually trying to strengthen those informal apprenticeship arrangements, but it means engaging, even though we're talking about the informal sector. Another way of characterising that is by saying it's the unorganised sector, but in some cases it's actually very organised because they have associations, they have industry groupings, and so it's the same sort of principle in terms of engaging with employers in that sector is going through bodies like the National Crafts Association, because in experience in Africa in particular, they're actually interested as much about improving quality in supply chains as they are in more developed countries. I mean, obviously the markets they're focusing on influence the extent to which that's a priority. But even for the domestic market, one of the reasons the FNAN wanted to work with its members on this issue is because they wanted to deal with perceived quality defects in the products that were being produced for the local market, because they were facing competition from external providers. So you can run pilots in different sectors. In this case, the association established support roles. So this is the association taking a lead in brokering engagement with their members, which is a common sort of approach taken in different places. But I think one thing worth recognising here is the role that recognition of prior learning plays in the engagement with the informal sector. When you're dealing with master crafts people who typically haven't had a long experience in the education and training system, offering national certification often is the first certificate they've ever got in their lives through an RPL process, is a way of getting your foot in the door, having a discussion around skills, having a discussion around what they do in terms of training their apprentices, and linking that actually to a code of practice where you can try and address some of the decent work deficits would be our kind of poor working conditions, no wages, etc. You can engage in a dialogue on those issues by talking about apprenticeships and strengthening informal apprenticeships. Introducing a fixed duration. I mean, one of the ones we worked on in Bangladesh, it was 6 years for bag stitching as a trade. So, the apprentice is indentured for 6 years to learn the skill of bag stitching. So you can see there's room for sort of engagement on some of these issues. So that's informal apprenticeships.
5 minutes.
Okay. Another area, financing. Interesting discussions this morning. I went to the session on the apprenticeship levy here and how that's changing the dynamics within firms and within sectors. But I think that's also clearly a way of driving employer engagement. And I think there's some good examples of the use of training funds, for example, in Singapore, about how it's really targeted to shifting the focus on higher level skills. So if you pay the levy, I know this is a different example, but you pay the levy, you can't recoup that levy for training at lower levels. You have to focus it on higher levels. So it's about shifting the enterprise workforce into a different sort of space through the use of financing mechanisms. And the example here from Thailand, where we had some contributions, it's about using the structure of the levy to engage enterprises in training and delivery. Questions obviously around administration and whether small enterprises can engage in the system and participate it because of the transaction costs. And again, the role of intermediaries come up there, but that's enough of that. I'll have to flick through this. You could call this a skill ecosystem in a sense. It was something led by the unions in India. Moradabad's a brassware cluster, but they did some interesting work. They did a local labour market assessment amongst their members. It was tripartite, so we had the government, the employers, the export houses, and the unions involved on a cluster basis, doing a survey, looking at different areas, identifying skills gap and training needs analysis, and going through the process of developing training in response to that. Again, RPL and gap training of workers, master craftspeople leading to national certification, and functional literacy and numeracy training as a supplement as well. And then some good follow-up which showed that there was improved workplace safety and health conditions, and you see there injury rates, etc. So, you know, that coordination at a local level, particularly in a country like India where there is a myriad of schemes that operate at a local level, and it's very difficult for local administrators to actually take the lead because they don't, in many cases, understand which scheme is applicable and how they can use it. Because we played the role of facilitator, by taking that facilitating role, bringing people together within an ecosystem, you know, it's like leading a, well, I was going to say leading a horse to water, but in this case it did drink, so that's probably not the best analogy. But there's some photos from Moradabad. You see some cool shots, you know, people in the streets and coming together to deal with skill-related issues. So in terms of success factors, I mean, it's not rocket science, you know, in terms of where you might be, but I think this question about there being, you know, genuine skills in an issue in a sector that needs to be grappled with, drives engagement, where there's trust between stakeholders, and in systems where you've got no history of employers and the education and training system working together, that does take some time because of the power, you know, differentials. Government aren't prepared to give up some of the roles and responsibilities and allow industry to run with that. When they have a clear and meaningful role in the system that can affect positive change, and it's not just some token sort of advisory function. When you get the right people from, you know, that have credibility in the sector to be involved in some of these changes. When they're funded or they're given the opportunity to generate income, and I guess you know, you can't deny where you don't have a tradition of this kind of reform in the system, you do need technical assistance in there, because that experience and that sort of understanding about how it works just isn't there. Yeah, that's our picture. Thanks very much.